Hey everyone, welcome back to the Majesty of Reason. I'm Joe Schmid, and today I'm joined by Dr. Brian Cutter to comprehensively respond to every single objection to dualism. Actually, that's a little bit of an exaggeration, of course, but at least we're looking at maybe most of the major arguments against dualism and thereby in favor of physicalism. Brian is a philosophy professor at Notre Dame. I've linked his work in the description and other interviews that I've done with him, so everyone please check that out. But without further ado, let's dig into the presentation.
Thanks. Happy to be here. Okay, so as Joe mentioned, we'll be looking at objections to dualism and going through some of the main responses, including some commentary of what I take to be the best responses. So just to start out, we've got this kind of standard distinction between property dualism and substance dualism. So property dualism says basically there are two kinds of fundamental properties, physical and mental. Substance dualism says there are two kinds of concrete things, physical and mental. As I use the terms, property dualism is the more inclusive view. So substance dualism will be a version of property dualism, but one can be a property dualist while also being a substance monist. So maybe there's just physical substances, but some of those physical substances like brains or living bodies have two kinds of properties, physical and mental. So I'll try to note where it's relevant, this distinction along the way. Some of these objections just target substance dualism, some target the weaker thesis of property dualism. So jumping right in, probably the most famous objection to dualism. So we're going to go through a lot of objections that have to do with different worries about causal interaction in one way or another between immaterial minds and material bodies. There's different flavors of this objection. So there's one category of objection that we'll call the interaction problem or the interaction problems, which mainly target substance dualism, the idea that there's like an immaterial mind or soul that interacts with your physical body, where the interaction problem just says, well, if your mind is this immaterial thing, presumably in order to explain the correlations between mind and body, like the correlations between your states of consciousness and your brain states, we're going to have to posit some kind of causal interaction between those two elements. But for various reasons, it has been argued that an immaterial mind couldn't interact with a physical body or brain. Different reasons have been given for this, so let's look at a few possible reasons. So sometimes the rhetoric around this says something like, well, according to substance dualism, mind and body are fundamentally different kinds of things. So how could they possibly interact? Where the underlying assumption seems to be that if you've got two things that are very, very different, they couldn't interact. I don't think this is a very serious worry. I mean, I don't know, you can put a banana in a toaster and I bet they'll causally interact, but bananas and toasters are very different kinds of things. Okay, that's a little bit cheeky because you might say, well, they're made of some of the same kinds of elementary particles and so forth. But even at the level of elementary particles, you could have an elementary particle that has mass like an electron interact with a massless particle like a photon. I mean, these things happen. It's fine. It's fine for very different kinds of things. It's fine for fields to interact with particles. I don't see any particular worry here. A more serious version of the interaction problem, a more serious argument that they couldn't interact, invokes what I'll call a locality principle, which says that causal interaction requires spatial contact. So a version of this worry was famously raised by Princess Elizabeth of Bohemia in her letter correspondence with Descartes. She raised this as a challenge or a question anyway for Cartesian dualism. But if we wanted to put it in the form of an objection, we would say, look, if you've got an immaterial mind and a material body, they couldn't interact because causal interaction requires spatial contact. This at least seems to be the way it works in large swaths of the physical world. If you want, one billiard ball to directly affect the motion of another billiard ball, it's got to be by way of spatial contact. Maybe the cue ball can affect the 8 ball in an indirect way, but it's going to be by chains of spatial contact. It knocks into this ball, which knocks into that ball, and so forth. And so generalizing from these mundane cases, you might think that any case of causal interaction requires something like spatial contact. So we'll call this the locality principle, where the thought is, well, immaterial minds being immaterial, they're not the sorts of things that are located in space or have spatial extension. And so they're not the right kinds of things that could make spatial contact with, say, the matter of the brain. Few different responses that we could give to this. I'll just kind of go through the menu of options. So one response that some substance dualists like is what I'll call the ghost model of the soul, which says, look, the soul or the immaterial mind, even though it's immaterial, it does have some properties that are characteristic of material things. In particular, it's got spatial extension, or at least spatial location. And so it can just make spatial contact with the matter of the brain and thereby kind of push it around, or maybe have its states pushed around by the matter of the brain in the other direction. I don't particularly like this way of thinking about the soul. I don't know if I have any particular objections to it. It strikes me as a little bit silly, but I don't have much more to say against it than that. It does straightforwardly, answer this challenge. There would be a question of, so on this view, like the soul kind of hovers around and follows around the brain or the body, and you would want some kind of theory as to how it consistently moves with the body so as not to be left behind when the body moves. So anyway, there would be some work to be done for this theory, but I don't see any knockdown objections to it.
I can probably add in there a little bit. We would want some sort of account of, well, firstly, is it extended versus is it like a point? So that's a choice point.
I think it would have to be extended on this picture, because if it's going to affect the matter in the brain, I guess if it was punctate, if it was a point, it could maybe affect the matter at that particular point without violating locality.
It could jump around really quickly and move.
Yeah, but presumably, in order to well, first of all, if you think of matter to mind causation, your state of consciousness is going to be sensitive not just to what matter is doing at any particular point, but to kind of global distributed patterns of processing. So you're probably going to want extension. But yeah, then there's a question of what exactly is its extension?
Yeah, what are its boundaries? And then you get all these worries about vagueness. And anyway, you raise a lot of additional worries and puzzles for the view if you take this. And maybe that's one way to precisify the kind of ickiness reaction that you had. But I also share the kind of ickiness reaction.
Yeah. So anyway, let's look at some other options and see if we can do better. So another response historically to this kind of worry, which is basically Leibniz's response, is to deny that there is any interaction between mind and matter, because minds are not the sorts of things that can be located in space, and you want to accept locality. This, by the way, is not exactly Leibniz's motivation, but this could be a motivation for a no interaction view. You can say, well, mind and matter just don't causally interact. Okay, you can't be done there, because again, there are these obvious correlations between states of mind or states of consciousness on the one hand and physical states of your brain and body on the other. You're going to have to explain these correlations. They're not just a fluke. And so, Leibniz's picture is one of pre-established harmony. Basically, God set things up from the beginning, so as to ensure that mind and matter always march in step. Okay, so this, I think, just absolutely does not work as a response to the locality version of the interaction problem, because on this view, you require God to causally influence matter so as to ensure a harmonious correspondence between the behavior of matter and the behavior of mind. But that interaction itself violates locality because God himself is an immaterial being not located in space. And so if he's going to push matter around, that's going to be a case of causal interaction without spatial contact. Now you could say, well, God is special, which presumably he is, and so maybe the rules for divine causation are not the same as the rules for creaturely causation. But by the same token, you could say, well, immaterial minds are special, and so maybe those don't follow the same rules that are followed by kind of intraphysical causation. That brings us to the third response, which is my preferred response, which is to just deny the locality condition on causation. So you say, well, it might be true in many cases, but it's not true as a universal metaphysical principle that wherever there's causal interaction, that goes by way of spatial contact. So a couple of things to say here. First, locality doesn't even clearly hold within the physical domain. So there's the much discussed case of entangled particles and the sorts of phenomena associated with Bell's inequality in the philosophy of quantum mechanics that, there's a lot of debate about how to interpret what's going on here. But at least one popular interpretation here is that you have some kind of non-local influence of like one entangled particle on another space-like separated entangled particle where that's not mediated by any kind of spatial contact. So you need something like that, arguably, in order to explain the correlations between measurement readings of different entangled particles that are very far apart. Okay, so maybe even within the physical domain, you can get, in certain cases, violations of the locality principle. But even if it turns out that within the physical domain, locality is the rule, I don't see any big cost with saying like, yeah, that's the way it goes with intraphysical causation, but we shouldn't elevate that principle of physical to physical interaction to the status of a necessary metaphysical principle that holds for all possible causal interaction. I mean, after all, it doesn't look like locality is a conceptual truth. I mean, when you think about scenarios, conceptually possible scenarios involving like telekinesis, where like with using the force and the power of my mind, I can like lift objects far away. Like that looks like a kind of spooky action at a distance that violates locality. It's causation without any kind of mediating spatial contact. But those are conceptually possible scenarios, or think of conceptually possible like magic scenarios where someone on one side of the world casts a spell and that immediately causes like a candle to go out on the other side of the world or whatever. These are cases of causation that are kind of conceptually possible that seem to violate locality. So locality doesn't have the status of a conceptual truth. Maybe it is inductively supported for kind of intraphysical causation, but I think the mind, according to this view, is fundamentally different from physical stuff. It wouldn't be surprising if the rules that hold for purely physical causal interactions didn't hold for immaterial to material interactions in one way or another. So, do you have anything to add about these interaction
problems? I was literally going to say the last sentence that you said. I was going to say, like, listen, according to the view in question, it's totally unsurprising that this is the domain where this inductive generalization would break down, precisely because the proposal is that there's this non-physical thing without spatial boundaries and extension and whatnot. So you covered that point quite well, and I think we could just move on.
Yeah, good. Okay, so this leads naturally to a nearby problem that I think it's closely related, but it's interestingly different. So this is the pairing problem, and this is centrally, again, a problem for substance dualism. So a version of this is raised by Jae-Gwon Kim. And basically the thought is, without something like spatial relations between mind and body, we can't explain certain contrastive facts about causation. In particular, we can't explain like why this mind influenced this body rather than this other one. So that's a little bit abstract. Let's kind of illustrate with some examples. So suppose you've got two duplicate pool tables, maybe on opposite sides of the Earth. And on table 1, let's say, in the United States, there's, a white ball, W1, which causes a black ball to move, the 8 ball to move. And then on the other table, let's say in China, you've got a qualitatively identical white ball causing a qualitatively identical black ball to move. Okay, so W1 causes B1 to move, W2 causes B2 to move. We can ask the contrastive question. Why, in virtue of what, did W1 cause B1's movement rather than B2's movement? So why did W1 cause B1 to move rather than cause B2 to move? And the obvious answer here is, well, it's in virtue of the spatial relationships between W1 and B1. So the white ball in America was like very closely spatially related to, indeed made spatial contact with the black ball in America, wasn't similarly spatially related to the black ball over in China. And in virtue of that spatial difference, that's why it caused the first black ball to move and not the second black ball. Okay, now we can ask a parallel question about mind to body interaction. So suppose we've got, in two sides of the Earth, two duplicate minds and bodies. So we've got mind M1, which let's say undergoes some like itch experience and causes body B1 to scratch. And then we've got mind M2, which undergoes a qualitatively identical itch experience, and that causes B2 to scratch. Okay, so we can ask the parallel contrastive question. In virtue of what did M1 affect B1 rather than B2? And the pairing problem basically just says the dualist doesn't have a plausible answer to this. So, what does the materialist say about this case? Well, minds are something like brains on the materialist view. And so the materialist answer to like, why did this mind affect this body is going to be parallel to the billiard ball case. Like your brain is like spatially related to your body in a very intimate way. And your brain is not similarly spatially related to the body on the other side of the world. And that's why the stuff going on in your brain affected this body rather than that body. What can the substance dualist say to explain these contrastive facts about causation? So, just some options. This is not necessarily exhaustive, but I think these are some of the main ones. So again, you could go in for a ghost model of the soul, have the soul be spatially located, hovering around the brain or the body or something like that. Then you just do have the spatial relation. So everyone should agree that that solves the pairing problem. So I guess this is mainly a problem for substance dualist views that don't want to go in for kind of what I'm calling the ghost model of the soul. Another option is we could posit a new primitive external relation. It's kind of analogous to spatial relations, but not a spatial relation. We'll call it the union relation. So we'll just say, okay, in addition, you've got this immaterial soul, M1. You've got this physical body, B1, and they are related, not spatially, but by, let's say, a quasi-spatial or analogous to spatial. And anyway, some kind of external relation, call it union. And it's in virtue of the fact that M1 is united with, bears this primitive external relation to B1, that its conscious states affect B1 rather than B2. It doesn't stand in the union relation to B2, just like the first billiard ball doesn't stand in the relevant spatial relation to W2. Okay, or to the other black ball. That's a view. I don't particularly see any problems with this. I mean, maybe it's a little bit mysterious what this new external relation is, but we can kind of introduce it as a theoretical posit whose job description is to explain contrastive facts about causation. That doesn't seem like an illegitimate move to me, but there are other options. So let's look at some others. So one proposal on the table is you posit that souls have hexaetistic powers, that is, powers to influence like this particular object as opposed to any old object that happens to stand in a relevant relationship to it. So this is normally thought to be like very different from the way that typical physical powers operate. So, if you got an electron, it has the power to, let's say, attract protons. But it has the power to attract kind of protons in general that happen to be around. It's not like you would credit the electron with like a hexaetistic power to attract this particular proton and only that one. No, it's got this kind of more generic power to attract any old proton that happens to be, in the vicinity. So the thought here is, well, the power of souls is different. It kind of targets particular entities rather than targeting any old entity that happens to be around or any old entity that happens to stand in the right relationship to it. So on this view, you might say like you've got this immaterial soul, M1, and one of its basic causal powers is just the power to influence the activity in this particular body rather than in bodies in general, say. Okay, so again, there's an objection saying, well, we don't see in the physical world evidence of this kind of power. In the physical world, all the powers are like non-hexaetistic. They're general, they're qualitative. I'm not sure if this is a huge worry for the same reasons that came up with the locality principle. Souls are radically different. Would it be so surprising if the kinds of causal powers that souls have are different and don't play by all the same rules as the causal powers of physical things? Doesn't seem hugely problematic to me.
Yeah, before maybe we go on to perhaps your favored solution here, I did just want to comment on some of these, or at least the new primitive external relation one. Now, I'm not sure so I don't recall, I was writing stuff down when you said this, but just for the audience, and you can correct me if I'm mistaken about this, but my understanding of an external relation is, well, we can contrast it with an internal relation. An internal relation is such that whether it holds among certain entities depends only on the intrinsic features of those entities, whereas that's external relations are ones that aren't internal relations. So distance is a paradigm example of an external relation, because even holding fixed the intrinsic character, say, of my water bottle and me, that doesn't determine the spatial relationship between us. My water bottle still could be a mile away. It could be 5 meters away. So like whether or not we stand in a particular distance relation does not depend only on the intrinsic features of me and my water bottle. So that's just for the audience. That's my understanding of an internal and external relation. Two things that I wanted to say on this. One was, it still does at least seem to be theoretically costly to just have to posit, to be kind of forced into positing a new primitive relation that seems at least kind of maybe mysterious, that we don't maybe have a pre-theoretical grip on. So that's one potential cost of this that I wanted to lay out. And then a second thing that I wanted to lay out to see your thoughts on was, I've always had a little bit of, and maybe this is unjustified, maybe this happens all the time in science, but I've always had a little bit of resistance to positing things that are, I guess, purely functionally characterized. Like we posit, like this happens in hylomorphism, right? Where people try to posit forms. And I always ask, what's a form? Like, I don't quite know what a form is. And they're always like, well, it's a principle of unity. In other words, it's what explains why the various parts of a substance are kind of collected together. It's what explains maybe identity. It's what explains maybe persistence through time. It's what explains. So they give me all these functional characterizations of what form does. And I'm like, okay, okay, that's what it does. But what is it? Like, I have no clue. And if I also have no clue what it is, it's like, it's hard for me to see how we even have a satisfying explanation of the various things that this thing was posited to explain, because it's purely functionally characterized. I don't know what it is. And so I don't even have a greater grip of how it actually does the explaining of the relevant phenomena. It's as if we've just, I find water, I find a puddle or something, and I ask for an explanation of it, and it's like, yes, well, there's something which explains the water, and I'm like, well, okay, yeah, sure, there is something which serves the functional role of explaining the water, but it's like, have I made any explanatory headway here? Have I made any explanatory progress? I worry. It doesn't seem like I have. So I'm wondering what you think about those two thoughts.
Good. So I don't know if I have the same allergy to positing things that we can only characterize functionally. I mean, in a way, isn't this just kind of the standard situation within at least highly theoretical parts of science? We this is the kind of like Ramsey-Lewis vision. We hypothesize that there's an X and a Y that do so and so things, and so we've got this like Ramsey sentence, and the things that like satisfy those descriptions just count as the reference of our theoretical terms if there are things that play that role. And then it might be that like we still lack insight into the intrinsic nature of those properties and relations. And I think that's true. I mean, I suspect like, there's like a mass quiddity. There's like this categorical quality that plays the causal role described by the equations in physics governing mass. And there is a real ignorance there. Like we don't have insight into the nature of that quality. We just kind of know what it does. We have the equations describing what it does, but there is a kind of ignorance associated with what Lewis calls Ramseyan humility there. So I guess I see this as similar. So it's true that this second proposal says there is some external relation that plays the role of explaining contrastive facts about causation. That's the role it plays, but I haven't told you like its inner nature. And presumably it has an inner nature, but we don't have any insight into that, just like we don't have any insight into the categorical qualities that play the causal roles described by physics. It's just another situation like that. As to, does this actually give us a satisfying explanation? I mean, there is a kind of dormative virtue feeling here where it's like, well, we want an explanation of this phenomenon, and then we posit zoinks, where zoinks are, I'm going to characterize them functionally just as the thing that explains the phenomenon. Okay, that's not particularly satisfying. I guess I see the primitive external relation view is motivated something like this. So suppose we think, ultimately there are going to be like basic laws of nature governing psychophysical interaction. And if we follow the model of the physical domain, the laws shouldn't be hexaetistic. So they shouldn't mention particular objects. They should just mention like general kinds of objects. And so if we want a law that fits that mold, then we should say that, okay, a soul influences a brain when under some when they stand in a certain kind of qualitative relation. Okay, but spatial relations aren't going to do the trick if we're not on board with the ghost model of the soul. So we're going to have to posit some new external relation that kind of slots into that role in the laws of nature. That's kind of how I see it. I agree it's not like a particularly satisfying explanation, but I see this as more like not trying to give a satisfying scientific explanation of anything, but as responding to an objection, which says that if the soul is immaterial and not located in space, then there just can't be an explanation of contrastive facts about causation. And I thought as well, there certainly could be if there are these like extra external relations that are analogous to spatial relations and being external relations that explain these contrastive facts. So right now I'm just kind of going through the options, and none of these are quite my preferred option.
Yeah, and I think that's fair. I would maybe what that could indicate is that the proponent of the pairing problem might want to put this as maybe more of an abductive approach, where it's like, hey, we at least have, we as in the physicalists, have a better explanation of contrastive facts about causation or something like that.
Yeah, they at least have a very straightforward off-the-shelf explanation that's perfectly analogous to the billiard ball case, and more theoretical posits and work needs to be done for the dualist. I totally grant that point.
Yeah, and well, maybe here is a good place to at least briefly bring up my other point, which is maybe we shouldn't grant that. I mean, I don't know. Like, I don't quite see why. Again, maybe this is confused. This is sort of something at the edge of my thought. So I'm wondering what you think about it. I don't quite see why spatial contiguity explains contrastive facts about causation. I mean, go back to David Hume. I think he was at least right about this much. Alternative courses of reality are totally conceivable when the billiard ball approaches the other billiard ball on the table. Like, independently of experience, like, imagine Adam, the first human, comes across the billiard ball on the table, and he sees one billiard ball approaching for the first time. As far as Adam knows, the other ball could just explode, or it could just transport, or it could just disappear, or the other billiard ball could just fly away, or everything could. I mean, who knows what could happen? All this stuff is totally conceivable. And spatial contiguity really only seems to remove mystery about these contrastive facts of explanation, because we're so familiar with spatially contiguous things causing one another, right? But causal relations might conceivably have been totally different. Like, conceivably, when the billiard ball 1 comes up against billiard ball 2, billiard ball 1 actually causes, on the other side of the world, billiard ball 4 to run away. So it's really not clear to me, actually, how spatial contiguity really does remove mystery as to why these contrastive facts about causation obtain. So I'm wondering what you think about that response.
So I agree that it doesn't remove mystery in the sense that, I mean, the Humean point is right, that there isn't an intelligible a priori necessary connection between, any known causes and any known effects, even in the simplest billiard ball kinds of cases, for exactly the reasons you gave. So I don't see spatial relations as making it intelligible why it is that this one must affect that one in such and such way. But I do think spatial relations explain contrastive facts about causation in that, and I guess the way I think about this is, I mean, spatial relations are just written into the laws of nature governing causal interactions. So, I mean, just think about gravity. So you've got two duplicate star systems, with a star and a planet, and you apply Newton's laws to figure out which one is going to affect which and to what extent. And Newton's laws just mention spatial relations. And if you want to know which one affected which one to what degree, well, it's true that it's conceivable that the one far away could have been the causally responsible for the movement of this one. There's nothing a priori necessary about causation tracking spatial closeness, but as it happens, the laws do mention spatial relations as in the laws. And so if you want to know how is this thing going to affect that thing, well, you look at the inverse square law, and you got to take account of the distance and the square of the distance and so forth. And so because spatial relationships figure in the laws, they do explain these contrastive facts.
That's fair. We can move on. I think that's fair.
Okay. So I list this next one as my sort of preferred view, but I don't really have very settled views on this. There seem to be a number of acceptable options. But here's another response to the pairing problem. You could say that M1 influences B1 in virtue of the fact that they are each parts of the same substance. So on this picture, your immaterial soul and your body compose a single substance. Okay, that's going to immediately raise another contrastive question, which is, why is it that M1 composes with B1? Why is it that my soul composes with my body rather than your body? Why is it that M1 composes with B1 rather than B2? Now, at this point, you could say, well, maybe that's just primitive. Explanation needs to end somewhere. And by the way, the materialist has their primitives in even the billiard ball cases. So they say, well, white ball 1 moves white ball 2 because of the spatial relationship between them. But why is it that white ball 1 was in spatial contact with black ball 1? Sorry, I think I'm getting the variables wrong. Well, why was white ball 1 in spatial contact with black ball 1 rather than with black ball 2? Well, that's just going to be primitive. I mean, the spatial facts are going to be presumably irreducible primitives. So everyone's going to have their primitives at some point. So maybe the maybe this is an acceptable place for the dualist to have their primitive. Or maybe there's a deeper explanation for why my soul composes with this particular body rather than your body. And maybe that's because my soul kind of came into being as a result of facts about this particular body, or at least my soul's existence was occasioned by the existence of this particular body, whenever the soul comes into being. This is sometimes called the kindling hypothesis. So again, you can ask, okay, but why is it that this particular soul was caused or occasioned by this particular body rather than some other particular body? There, I think that's probably going to be primitive. I mean, it's going to bottom out in primitive somewhere, but I think that seems like an acceptable place. By the way, you could just have the kindling hypothesis as a direct answer to the pairing problem rather than as an answer to why is it that these compose a single subject. So you could say, like, in virtue of what does M1 affect B1 rather than B2? Well, in virtue of the fact that M1 was caused or occasioned by B1. That's the kind of relationship that explains the contrastive fact. So, that would be an option on the table. My view of the pairing problem is it's not clear which of these responses is the best one or the most plausible, but they all seem kind of okay and on the table. None of them seems too costly to me. So I'm not too bothered by the pairing problem.
I think that's fair. And we have spent a little bit more time on this one, so maybe we should just move on to the next one.
Okay, so another worry about causal interaction that I think is a little bit more serious than the ones we've talked about so far is worry about causal exclusion. So the other versions of the interaction problem we've looked at kind of rely on what you might think as like a priori metaphysical principles about what's allowed to interact with what, whereas this one relies more centrally on alleged empirical discoveries. So it starts with what we'll call the causal completeness principle, which says that every physical event involved in human behavior and brain processing can be fully causally explained in terms of prior physical causes. So the thought is, if you want to know, why does my arm go up? Well, the explanation for that, you can give a complete causal explanation in terms of prior physical causes, like, my muscles contracting. And why did the muscles contract? Well, you can give a complete causal explanation of why the muscles contract in terms of like motor neurons firing. And why did the motor neurons fire? Well, again, according to this principle, you can give a complete causal explanation of that in terms of prior physical causes about like incoming signals and neurotransmitters and action potentials and so forth. And so the thought is there's no point in the physical process having to do with brain processing or behavior where you need to reach outside the physical domain in order to give a complete causal explanation. Everything that happens within the physical domain can be fully causally explained by prior events within the physical domain. That's what the causal completeness principle says. This is allegedly an empirical discovery or something that's at least well empirically supported. Okay, and then from here we say, well, given causal completeness, the dualist is forced into one of two allegedly bad options. So the two options would be, either they need to go in for epiphenomenalism, where they say, mental events or conscious states or whatever don't have any physical effects at all. So you feel pain and you say, ow, and you nurse your wound, but the pain didn't cause you to do that. Or you go in for a kind of systematic overdetermination, which says that, maybe the pain does cause your, withdrawal behavior and causes you to say, ouch. But whenever the pain causes you to do something, there was already a complete set of physical causes that was sufficient for that exact same effect. So every case of mental causation is a case of redundant causation. Well, like the mental states really do cause things, but in a completely redundant way. It's kind of like what happens in a firing squad where two people shoot the the guy at the same time. Each bullet on its own was sufficient for the guy's death. It just so happened that there were two causes, both sufficient for the effect at the same time. According to the overdetermination view, something like this happens every single time a conscious state influences your physical behavior or physical brain processes. Okay, and then so the argument is just like, given causal completeness, you're forced into one of these two options, and both of these options are implausible according to the argument. So let's just look at some of the potential responses here. So basically we've got three options. We could either accept epiphenomenalism, accept overdetermination, or deny causal completeness. So let's look at those options. So the first, maybe epiphenomenalism isn't so bad. So David Chalmers is probably the most prominent philosopher in recent times to have defended dualism. He goes in for basically a version of epiphenomenalism in his book, The Conscious Mind. Frank Jackson, when he gave the famous knowledge argument with Mary in the Black and White Room. That paper is called Epiphenomenal Qualia. He was happy to go in for a kind of epiphenomenalism. Now, there's an immediate worry with epiphenomenalism, which is like, it certainly seems like conscious states are influencing behavior all the time. You have a feeling of conscious thirst, and that typically is followed by like drinking water. You have a feeling of pain, and that's typically followed by certain behaviors like saying ouch and withdrawing from the stimulus. And so there's certainly like the appearance of causation going on here, and it's not like this is just a complete coincidence. So what's going on here? Well, the epiphenomenalist has an explanation. They say, okay, we've got what tempts us to think that conscious states causally influence behavior is roughly, there's like a correlation or a constant conjunction between certain kinds of conscious states and certain kinds of subsequent behaviors. But we know that, there are multiple ways of explaining a correlation. You don't need to posit a causal arrow between X and Y to explain why X and Y are correlated. Sometimes the correlation is explained by the fact that there's some third factor, a common cause Z, that influences both X and Y. And so that's what's going on in this case, according to the epiphenomenalist. So why is it that every time I have the conscious feeling of thirst, I subsequently go and drink water? It's not because the conscious feeling of thirst is causing me to drink water. Rather, there's some underlying brain state that both causes the feeling of thirst and somewhat later causes the water drinking behavior. And basically, they're going to say anytime it looks to us like a certain conscious state is causing a certain physical effect, what's really going on is those two things are joint effects of a common cause. So the conscious state is not causally influencing the physical thing. So, okay, I think that works perfectly well to explain the correlations. There's other objections that are kind of lame, I think, to epiphenomenalism. So, if you think that knowing that P requires that your belief that P be caused by the fact that P, a kind of causal theory of knowledge, then it looks like epiphenomenalism makes it impossible for us to know about our conscious states. Standard reply here is just, well, there's other plausible counterexamples to causal theory of knowledge. We know about math, but mathematical facts are supposed to be causally inert. We know about the future, like the sun will rise tomorrow. That didn't cause my belief. So I'm not too worried about that. There's similar objections having to do with reference. Maybe referring to X requires some kind of causal connection between X and your beliefs or your acts of reference. I think there are plausible models of how we could refer to our phenomenal states that don't require that are compatible with epiphenomenalism. So Chalmers develops a kind of constitutive model where our phenomenal judgments are partly constituted by our conscious experiences. And so those judgments can kind of make reference to those experiences, not by way of a causal relation, but by way of a constitutive relation. I think that's a perfectly fine theory. I'm not a huge fan of epiphenomenalism myself, mainly because I like views on which there are like robust forms of free will. And I think epiphenomenalism is going to be hard to square with robust views of free will. But I think those are very separate issues that don't really need to come into play here. If you're just kind of impressed with like explanatory gap style arguments against physicalist views of consciousness, which are the main motivation for people like Chalmers and Frank Jackson, then I don't think there are any really big problems with epiphenomenalism. So I think that that should be a view on the table. It's very counterintuitive. It's contrary to what we're initially inclined to think, but beyond that, it's hard to give very powerful objections to it. The other possibility, or the second possibility, is we could embrace overdetermination. So the first thing to say here is, when I described the overdetermination view, I made it sound really weird and bad. Like every time a mental state causes physical behavior, it's like a firing squad case of overdetermination. But we know that in nature, there are tons of cases of like what we can call benign overdetermination. So like maybe a scale goes down because the object was over 10 pounds. But also we could say like, well, the fact that it was 11 pounds was causally sufficient for that same effect. So there's a kind of overdetermination here, like the fact that it's over 10 pounds, that's not the same fact as the fact that it's 11 pounds. But both seem to like be perfectly good causal explanations for why we get that outcome. It's a kind of overdetermination, but not one that should bother us very much. Or, maybe a bird is trained to peck at a chip whenever it's red. So we could explain why the bird pecked by saying, well, it was because the chip was red. We could also cite the more specific fact that it was scarlet. That at least was causally sufficient for the peck. So we've got these kind of two distinct facts or events that are each causally sufficient for the outcome. That kind of thing happens all the time. Doesn't seem particularly problematic. Or, in general, whenever we cite like a kind of coarse-grained macroscopic property of an object to explain some effect, there's also going to be some fully maximally specific microphysical realization of that macro property that's also causally sufficient in the circumstances for that effect. So again, a kind of overdetermination, but not something we're very bothered by. So the move here might be, look, there's a kind of overdetermination that's ubiquitous in nature, and that's let's say benign. It's not the bad kind. So maybe the kind of overdetermination the dualist needs, who accepts the causal completeness principle, maybe that's similarly not a very bad kind of overdetermination. Now there's a standard reply at this point, which is like, okay, but all those examples I mentioned of benign overdetermination, there was a kind of very modally robust relationship between the two properties. So in the case of being 11 pounds versus being over 10 pounds, the first metaphysically necessitates the second. Maybe it also like grounds or constitutes, but there's like a very tight, like metaphysically necessary connection between those two properties. Whereas that's not the case for dualism about like my brain state and my state of consciousness. So if you want to say like, yes, my brain state caused me to say ouch, but also my experience of pain caused me to say ouch. The dualists typically will not say that there's a metaphysically necessary connection there. They'll say it's only like a nomologically necessary connection. Given the laws of nature, if you have this brain state, you're going to have that experience, but it's not. It's the connection isn't quite as tight as it is between like being 11 pounds and being over 10 pounds. But I think this response actually doesn't work, because the same point goes for many popular forms of physicalism. So in particular, like role functionalist views, where like you count as being in pain in virtue of having some state that plays a certain causal role within the cognitive economy of your brain and body. So the thought here is, on this view, your like fully specific physical realizer state, that is causally sufficient in the circumstances for your behavior. And so, that's a perfectly good causal explanation. Also, if you want to say that the pain causes your behavior, that looks like a good explanation. But on the functionalist view, the fully specific microphysical realization does not metaphysically necessitate the pain. because in worlds with different laws, the causal facts would have been different. That particular physical state might have played a different functional role, and so would not have realized pain. The role functionalist physicalist is going to want to say, like, yeah, the realizer state is causally sufficient for the behavior. Also, the pain is causally relevant to the behavior too, but there's not a metaphysically necessary connection there. And so, there's differences between the connection of that the role functionalist posits between the physical realization and the mental state, and the connection that the dualist posits. So you could try to like gerrymander your principle of like when overdetermination is bad so that it only rules out only counts the dualist kind of overdetermination as bad. But my feeling about these debates is we don't have a good theory of when overdetermination is the benign case or the bad case. And it's really hard to formulate principles here. And you can, if you want, like write up a principle that only makes the dualist look bad and doesn't make any popular form of physicalism look bad. But I think the standard examples don't really motivate those principles, and it's all just kind of a mess. And so I guess my feeling about overdetermination is it's not a very unattractive view at the end of the day. I think, you shouldn't feel if you go in for the overdetermination option, I don't think that there's any really serious objections to that.
One potential worry is that well, maybe this is ultimately getting to the free will point that you mentioned, but we tend to think that we are like difference makers. Had I not had this thirst in my mind, then I wouldn't have got up and gone and get the water. But like if we have overdetermination, we might think that that's not the case. And so at least if we take it as a kind of intuitive datum that mental states, mental phenomena, and even perhaps agent causation serves as a real kind of difference maker in the world. We have a kind of difference-making causation, not just causal impact, but difference-making causal impact. This account at least seems unable to vindicate that plausible intuition or perhaps even datum. But I'm wondering what you think about that.
Well, it's a little bit dicey how to evaluate these counterfactuals, but I think you can easily say, like, yeah, if I hadn't felt pain, I wouldn't have said, ow. If I hadn't felt thirst, I wouldn't have gone to drink the water. And the way we're thinking about these counterfactuals in an overdeterminationist friendly view is like, yeah, I go to the nearest worlds where I don't have pain. And, you try to hold fixed the laws as much as possible. And so those are going to be worlds where I also have a different underlying physical state that, and since it's a different underlying physical state, that you run that world forward with the same laws, and it doesn't lead to you saying, ow. So, that feels a little bit like backtracking, right? You're saying like, well, if I hadn't had the pain, then the actual physical causes of that pain wouldn't have been there. And some other physical state would have been there instead, which would have led to something other than me saying, ow. That normally we want to rule out backtracking conditionals in testing for causation. But there's a way in which this actually isn't a backtracking conditional. It's not a temporally backtracking conditional, because presumably the underlying physical state is simultaneous with the pain, and so you're not necessarily like going back in time and changing the temporally prior conditions. But anyway, I think there's at least room to say, yeah, that counterfactual is true, that if I hadn't felt pain, I wouldn't have said ow. And so we can get a kind of difference making. There's another counterfactual, like if I hadn't felt pain, but my physical state had been actually exactly as it actually was, then I still would have said ow. That maybe makes it sound like the pain isn't a difference maker. And so there'd just be a question like, which of these is the right test for causal efficacy? If it's the first counterfactual, then maybe we get the causal efficacy of the pain. If it's the second counterfactual, then maybe we don't in a sufficiently robust sense.
Yeah, and we definitely we don't need to get into the weeds here, but this would all, of course, get into the weeds of like the counterfactuals, how we are to assess those, whether or not we can allow for potential explanatory backtracking as opposed to temporal backtracking. It gets into the weeds very quickly, which we don't need to pursue here, but I just want to note for the audience, there might still be some remainder worries here. At least on my end.
I definitely think there's something kind of residually uncomfortable here. My thought is just, once you get into all the complexities, it's certainly far from obvious that there's anything really problematic about the overdeterminationist view. But that's not to say that it's definitely in the clear.
Sounds good. Let's move on then to, I think, your favorite response.
Yeah, so my preferred response is to just say, to deny the causal completeness principle, or I guess more modestly to say, this is an empirical claim and we don't have very good empirical evidence for it. We don't have very good empirical evidence to think that every physical occurrence that happens in your brain and body has a complete causal explanation in purely physical terms. So, I mean, we'll get into some of the worries about denying causal completeness in some of the future arguments, but just initially, I'll say our scientific understanding of the brain is still very immature. There's tons and tons we don't understand about the operations of the brain. And because of that, it's hard to see how we could have strong empirical grounds for thinking that there aren't some immaterial influences that shape and structure the brain's activities in interesting ways. It's not as though we have such a gears level understanding of the way the brain works that we know exactly how it would behave if only physical forces were operative, and then we can compare that to how it actually behaves. So sometimes we do have that gears level understanding of systems. So really simple systems, I've got a chain of 4 dominoes. Okay, I kind of understand the different components of the system. I know how it would behave if only these things were operative, and then I can compare that against how it actually behaves. We certainly don't have that in the case of consciousness, or in the case of the brain. Now, when I've asked neuroscientists or philosophers of neuroscience who know a lot more about neuroscience than I do, I ask them to what extent do we have empirical justification for this kind of causal completeness claim? And they'll typically say that's not really an empirical claim that we think we've got great evidence for. It's more like a methodological assumption. And I think it's certainly true that this is a working methodological assumption in neuroscience. We've got stuff going on in the brain, tons of stuff we don't really understand, but we're not considering the hypothesis that maybe this part of the brain lit up because it was directly influenced by the soul. We assume there's some kind of physical cause of why the brain is doing this, and oftentimes we don't know what that is, but as a kind of working methodological assumption, something like causal completeness is assumed. So that's fine, and maybe maybe that's legitimate as a methodological assumption, or maybe not. I don't know. But I do think that even though it is widely assumed in neuroscience, it seems plausible to me that it has more the status of a regulative ideal or a methodological assumption rather than something that we have strong empirical evidence for.
Very briefly here, I mean, do you think that maybe there's some sort of track record justification for thinking that the methodological assumption is at least a little bit more than an assumption, that it's at least probably true or something like that? Because I can imagine someone in the audience at least thinking that maybe not every time we've looked, but at least a lot of the times that we've looked into brain dynamics and whatnot and different structures responsible for certain functions, we find physical explanations in terms of either prior states of the brain or other maybe microstates of the brain, etc. So at least every or many times that we look, we find such physical explanations that seem to be sufficient. And we never seem, at least so far, to have come across a case where we need to appeal to some immaterial entity to explain things. So perhaps this is more than an assumption. It's at least maybe defeasibly justified, or maybe it's probably true or something like that because of this kind of track record. I'm wondering what you think about that.
So I don't know if that correctly states the scientific history or the track record. So, I mean, what's true is there are a lot of things that happen in the brain that have some, at least partial, physical causes. And presumably a lot of things that happen in the brain that have complete, sufficient physical causes. And in at least a large patchwork of cases, we've discovered those partial or full causes. But there's still a ton of, so it's not as though we we consistently just like find a physical event, and then ask why it occurred, and then like find the sufficient physical cause for that particular physical event, and then go on to the next physical event and ask why it occurred and find, oh, yep, it too has a sufficient physical cause, and then go on and on. Like if we had done that, like I agree that would be like inductive support. We just kind of like go through, like there's a raven and it's black. There's a raven and it's black. There's a raven and it's black. I think the actual situation is we find tons and tons of stuff going on. We ask like why, and most of it is like, yeah, I don't know. We don't have much of a theory. Some of it we find an explanation in physical terms, and since we're only looking for physical explanations, we find more and more of those, and probably there's a lot more to be found. And there remain a lot of things that we don't know how to explain, but maybe as a methodological assumption, we assume, yeah, probably has some kind of complicated physical cause, or maybe it's too complicated that we'll never understand it because this is a very complicated machine. But yeah, I don't know. Do things look much different from how they would look if like an immaterial mind were constantly like shaping and structuring brain activity in large parts of the brain? Doesn't seem to me that the empirical situation looks that much different. I'm certainly not saying that the fact that there's tons of stuff we don't understand about the brain is like evidence that there's non-physical influences. It's totally to be expected given how complex it is. Even if it were a purely physical system with only physical causes operative, you'd expect there to be lots of stuff that we don't understand. My claim is just like the situation is not that surprising on either hypothesis.
Yeah, or at the very least, we haven't been given sufficient reason to think that the way that the course of neuroscience has gone so far is super duper surprising on the dualist hypothesis, or at least much more surprising on the dualist hypothesis compared to the physicalist hypothesis. It's like, even if you don't make the positive claim that they're roughly equally surprising or whatever, like you could just say, well, listen, like the proponent of this argument hasn't sufficiently made their case that it's much more surprising under dualism than it is under naturalism. It, as in the kind of course of neuroscience and the course of findings that we've had. I also wanted to highlight for the audience, I hadn't even thought of that interesting point that you made, where there's almost kind of like a selection effect in terms of the sorts of explanations that we uncover. It's like, it's precisely because there's this methodological rule in place. When we look, we're looking for physical explanations. And so, given that there are at least some of them to be found, it's not really surprising that we would only then find those because we're only looking for them. So there's kind of like a selection effect, which might at least potentially screen off some of the evidential significance of the inductive generalization. But anyway, I thought that was an interesting point that I'd never considered.
I think related issues will come up with these next few objections. So you hear a lot of worries about conservation of energy thrown out about dualism. I should say, like, these are almost always thrown out by the materialist in a totally lazy way. Like, they'll kind of point vaguely to the physics and not show any real understanding of actually like what even the principle of conservation of energy says or entails or how it operates in physics, and like vaguely imply that it's some damning objection to dualism. Every single discussion I've seen that's like really careful about discussing the relationship between conservation of energy and dualism is always on the side of this actually isn't that big of a worry. But there are interesting issues that come up. So here's a classic statement from Dennett. He says, a fundamental principle of physics is that any change in the trajectory of any physical entity is an acceleration requiring the expenditure of energy. And where is this energy to come from? It is this principle of the conservation of energy that accounts for the physical impossibility of perpetual motion machines, and the same principle is apparently violated by dualism. This confrontation between quite standard physics and dualism has been endlessly discussed since Descartes' own day, and is widely regarded as the inescapable and fatal flaw with dualism. Just as would be expected, ingenious technical exemptions based on sophisticated readings of the relevant physics have been explored and expounded. Of course, Dennett is not going to mention them. But without attracting many conversions. Okay, so the worry is, well, if dualism is true, there's going to have to be some kind of violation of the conservation of energy, but that's like a sacred or at least well-established principle in physics, and so we should reject dualism. So there are a lot of ways of responding to this concern. One is to just go epiphenomenalist. The issue just doesn't arise if you think that conscious states or mental states generally don't have physical effects, then there isn't even a prima facie threat to the conservation of energy principle. There are a bunch of other responses that I haven't listed here. One is to say, well, maybe the soul itself can be associated with, or the immaterial mind or immaterial states of consciousness can themselves be associated with some new form of energy. So when the immaterial mind causes an electron to accelerate and thereby changes its energy, maybe the soul gains or loses some energy. Okay, that's going to be like a novel form of energy. Physics has introduced novel forms of energy before. So there's kinetic energy, and there's potential energy, and then there's chemical energy, and there's the stress energy tensor associated. I mean, there's light and sound, like it can embody energy, and heat and so forth. And so like energy can kind of like take on different forms, and so maybe there's some kind of like energy associated with the soul. I don't think anyone has even a half decent theory of how that would work. But like if you really wanted to uphold some kind of principle of the conservation of energy, you could try to develop that theory. You could also propose that the energy is conserved by some kind of conspiratorial canceling out. So whenever the soul causes a movement of one particle in one direction, there's a kind of counterbalancing movement in the other that like equalizes the energy. That seems to be in principle possible. Maybe it seems like a somewhat weird way for the soul to interact with matter, but I don't know, like that would, I don't see any problem in principle with maintaining the conservation of energy through a scheme like that. Another response you sometimes see, this is the conditional response, says, well, look, the conservation of energy principle only says that total energy stays constant within a causally isolated system. If the system is not causally isolated, all bets are off. But then they'll say, well, but given dualist interactionism, the brain isn't a causally isolated system. In fact, the whole physical universe is not a causally isolated system because it's impinged upon by the immaterial mind. And so the antecedent condition for just like is not fulfilled. And so there's no possibility of violating the principle of conservation of energy because its conditions, just its presuppositions just aren't satisfied. I'm not going to get too deep into the physics, and I'm not really qualified to get too deep into the physics, but Robin Collins notes that there are some limitations to this kind of conditional response, which is that there are other formulations of like nearby conservation of energy principles that don't require causal isolation. So the one he thinks is most relevant to the practice of physics is what he calls like the boundary conservation of energy principle, which says that the rate of change of total energy in any closed region of space is equal to the total rate of energy flowing through the spatial boundary of that region. And it seems to me that interactionism just is pretty guaranteed to violate that principle. So suppose that the soul causes like some particle to change its trajectory. So we get some kind of change of energy. Now just take the small spatial region enclosing just that particle. There's no like energy going through the boundaries of it. And so so it looks like within that spatial region, you're going to violate the boundary version of the conservation of energy. And that's true even if there's like some compensating movement elsewhere in the brain in a slightly different spatial region. I think you're still going to get a violation. If I understand the principle correctly, you're still going to get a violation of this version of the conservation of energy principle. So let's just grant that there are at least some, formulations of the conservation of energy principle that have currency within physics that are going to be in tension or in conflict with interactionist dualism. here you can just reply. Well, here's my tentatively preferred reply without having much expertise in the relevant physics, and here following largely Robin Collins. So Robin Collins says, well, we don't have good reason to think that the conservation of energy principle holds in general in the universe. And in principle, he claims that the relevant form of conservation of energy fails in general relativity. This is because apparently local energy can't be defined for gravitational fields, and so gravitational fields, they'll certainly like influence the movement of matter in various ways, but apparently in a way that like total energy just like is not going to be well defined, and so there's not going to be you're just not going to get the relevant version of the conservation of energy principle. Okay, I mean, I'm not qualified to go into the physics. I kind of trust him here. Maybe there's controversies in philosophy of physics about whether he's got the details right. But there's, at least some people who know their stuff who say like this principle, we don't even have reason to think that it holds in our current best physical theories. So maybe it's not so bad if dualism ends up conflicting with a principle that's not even true in general in the physical domain. Another thing to say here, which is analogous to what I said about the locality worries about dualist interaction, is just like, okay, is it so bad to say, like, maybe conservation of energy does turn out to hold for all purely physical interactions? Is it so bad to think that a principle that holds for purely physical interactions doesn't hold when it comes to interactions between mind and brain? Again, the immaterial mind is supposed to be radically different from physical things. Maybe the rules that apply to purely physical interactions just wouldn't apply to interactions between the immaterial mind and the material brain. I think sometimes people say, okay, but if then it looks like we've got some testable predictions here that could potentially embarrass the dualist, where we can like have someone like make a bunch of choices in a room and see if the temperature goes up, or potentially there's ways of testing whether you get increases or decreases in total energy in a system when there's a mind involved. And to this I say, like, if you can come up with a good experiment that tests that and calculates like the level of precision you'd need to measure the energy at in order to test the most plausible versions of this dualist hypothesis, like then do it. That seems kind of interesting. I kind of foresee some potential practical difficulties with performing this experiment. So for one thing, it could be that like, every time the immaterial mind affects the brain, there is some change in total energy, but on average, there's, an energy increase about as often as there's an energy decrease. And so, and each particular energy change is small enough, so you could only hope to measure them in the aggregate, but in the aggregate, the effects largely cancel out. I don't know why that wouldn't be the case. That's at least a possibility. So anyway, it seems to me to be at least tricky to empirically test. But if someone wants to empirically test this, that sounds like a good idea to me.
I'm happy with that discussion. Let's just move on to the next objection.
Cool. Okay, this is a related one, again appealing to physics, and again going beyond my expertise, but I'll comment briefly on it. So this, I've heard this objection floating around. I think you mentioned to me that this is popular in certain internet circles. So Sean Carroll claims that there's some kind of conflict between our core theories of physics and the idea that there's an immaterial mind that interacts with the physical world. So here's what Sean Carroll says. He says, as far as every experiment ever done is concerned, the Dirac equation is the correct description of how electrons behave at everyday energies. It's not a complete description. We haven't included the weak nuclear force or couplings to hypothetical particles like the Higgs boson, but that's okay, since those are only important at high energies and are short distances, very far from the regime of relevance to the human brain. If you believe in an immaterial soul that interacts with our bodies, you need to believe that this equation is not right, even at everyday energies. There needs to be a new term at a minimum on the right representing how the soul interacts with electrons. If that term doesn't exist, electrons will just go on their way as if there weren't any soul at all, and then what's the point? So any respectable scientist who took this idea seriously would be asking, what form does that interaction take? Is it local in space-time? Does the soul respect gauge invariance and Lorentz invariance? Does the soul have a Hamiltonian? Do the interactions preserve unitarity and conservation of information? Nobody ever asks these questions out loud, possibly because of how silly they sound. Once you start asking them, the choice you are faced with becomes clear. Either overthrow everything we think we have learned about modern physics or reject dualism. It is not a difficult decision as theory choice goes. Brief comment on, I'm going to pick out this last statement that nobody ever asked these questions out loud about, like, whether the soul respects gauge invariance and Lorentz invariance and whether it has a Hamiltonian and so forth. So I hereby charge Sean Carroll with the crime of using extremely obnoxious rhetoric. First of all, I don't think these questions are silly at all. To the extent that they're not the questions to be asking, it's because they're like way out ahead of ourselves. These are the sorts of questions you ask once you have like a much deeper, more detailed understanding of the mind and mind-brain interaction than we currently do. But whether it doesn't seem silly to me to ask these questions at all in principle, and smart people absolutely do ask these questions. So people like Eugene Wigner, who thought that like consciousness played a role in collapsing the wave function, theorized about how is like primitive immaterial consciousness related to what we know about the laws of quantum mechanics. You get similar work with the work of David Chalmers and Kelvin McQueen, trying to understand how consciousness might interact with known principles in quantum mechanics. I think these just are sensible questions to ask. We don't have like very successful theories developing, these ideas in detail. But the idea that like these are silly questions to ask, I think is just wrong. And anyway, that like what he says is the choice you are faced with, which is either overthrow everything we think we have learned about modern physics or reject dualism, is absolutely not the choice you are faced with. Obviously, first of all, you could be a kind of epiphenomenalist like David Chalmers circa 1996 and just like, there's not going to be any kind of top-down influence, and so physics will stay as is. Or you could say like, well, maybe there's just like new principles that apply where minds are acting on physical things, but still like all the stuff we learn about like how balls fall from the Leaning Tower of Pisa and how like almost everything in physics can like stay put. We can just like add some new principles, new causal principles that apply in a certain range of cases. So anyway, that's just a comment about the obnoxiousness of the rhetoric. But let's say something a bit more substantive. So I don't know what the Dirac equation is, but allegedly he thinks like this correctly describes and maybe completely describes the behavior of electrons at everyday energy levels that would be relevant to mind-brain interactions. So let's just suppose that if interactionist dualism is true, then the Dirac equation fails for like some number of electrons in the brain some of the time. Is this such a ridiculous result? Do we have good reason to think that this Dirac equation gives a complete and precise description of electrons even in the brain? Have we experimented on any electrons in the brain to see whether their behavior precisely conforms to the predictions of the Dirac equation? I don't know. I don't know what sorts of experiments you need to test whether electrons abide by the Dirac equation. Probably some of them involve like particle accelerators and conditions that like don't really play well with like, interacting with human subjects and living bodies. So I doubt that we've confirmed for any particular electrons, even a single one in any living brain, that it conforms precisely to the predictions of the Dirac equation. that's true for like most electrons in most places. So like nobody's experimented on any electrons in my basement to test whether they follow the Dirac equation. But I think Carol would say like it's a reasonable inductive projection to think that the electrons in my basement follow the Dirac equation. So similarly, it might be a reasonable inductive projection to think that the electrons in my brain do uniformly. I don't know if, I mean, in the current dialectical context, that seems like a pretty dicey inductive inference. Like if your opponent's view implies that, certain physical regularities hold in general, but with certain exceptions where there's like minds interacting with the system, then it would be weird to if your opponent's view implies that a certain regularity holds and it has exceptions, but only in circumstances of type X, then it would be odd to argue against this by pointing to all the cases in non-X circumstances where the regularity holds, because that's exactly what your opponent's view predicts. Like if you tell me, look, there are aliens on Earth, and they're all locked up inside of like high security government facilities. And I say, no, I don't think so, because I looked in a lot of places and I haven't seen any aliens. You say like, well, have you looked in any of the government facilities where my theory says they are? And I say, like, no, of course, like I can't get into those facilities. Like no one's gonna let me in there. Like the fact that I've like looked around my basement and not found any aliens is no disconfirmation of your theory if your theory says that the aliens are only in this place that I haven't looked. So, similarly, the dualist doesn't just say that like there are violations of the Dirac equation willy-nilly all over the place. They say that like where there are minds directly interacting with physical systems, then certain principles that hold in other cases maybe aren't going to hold in those particular physical systems. So you can't really argue against that view by pointing to all the physical systems where nobody thinks there are any minds interacting with them and show that the principles hold there. That's just, I mean, that the dualist would agree that with all those predictions. Yeah. Do you have thoughts about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think these are all fair rejoinders, and I think maybe this is changing the argument. But I think the best way for the defender of this quote unquote core theory argument to go here is just to say something like, listen, in light of what the at least interactionist dualists has had to kind of take on in response here, physicalism just looks maybe much, much simpler than dualism. It seems to take much less to kind of completely describe the fundamental elements of the theory of the world in the physicalists' case than in the dualists. And maybe that's because describing the world under physicalism, you only need one set of physical equations to do that. But the dualist needs like some sort of rules that specify how particles will behave differently when they're caught up in brains. And unless there's some way sort of like subsuming these two different sets of laws under some like deeper set of laws, well then on dualism, like when you're describing the world, you need the set of laws posited by the physicalist, namely like the physical descriptions of how electrons behave, in the Andromeda galaxy, for instance. Yeah. Plus, you need another set, seemingly, which either governs or somehow specifies what happens in some other smaller bits of reality. Plus a description of like which set governs which bits of reality, right? So like when there are certain brains and certain configurations and whatnot. And that just seems quite inelegant. It's not a very uniform hypothesis. It's not very simple. There are various theoretical vices here. So maybe that's the best way to put it.
Good. I think that basically is exactly the next objection that I'm going to look at. And so let's just go on to that.
Right. So, I just think the core theory argument doesn't work because it's just parasitic on these other arguments.
Yeah, good. And in basically the objection you outlined, I think this is the most forceful and concerning objection to dualism. And, you put it kind of in terms of like an Occam's razor objection, which is, I think it's a version of that, but maybe one that focuses specifically on the complexity of the laws of nature that we'll need in order to make dualism work. So let's look at arguments along these lines. So these are called nomological arguments. I'll start with some statements of the arguments from some recent and classic sources. So here's Adam Pouts stating a version of the worry. He says, if dualism is true, consciousness sticks out like a sore thumb. David Chalmers notes that physicists seek a set of fundamental laws governing the evolution of the universe, simple enough that one might write them on the front of a t-shirt. But if you accept dualism about consciousness, you are going to need a bigger t-shirt. In addition to the laws of physics governing the evolution of physical systems, you will need anomalous psychophysical laws linking certain physical systems, brains, with all the variety of conscious experiences. And there is reason to think that these psychophysical laws resist compact systematization. They can't be summarized by a small set of simple principles, in other words. So dualism would ruin the dream of a world governed by a small handful of fundamental laws so simple that they might fit on an ordinary t-shirt. JJC Smart, who's one of the classic sources of this kind of objection, says, the idea that everything should be explicable or reducible in terms of physics except the occurrence of some sensations seems to me frankly unbelievable. In the same place, he goes on to say that the laws that you would need to connect brain states to conscious states are fundamentally different from the sorts of laws that we get elsewhere in physics. So they would need to relate complex systems with billions of particles and trillions upon trillions of billions of neurons and trillions upon trillions of elementary particles with simple conscious sensations. That's fundamentally unlike the kind of basic laws of physics we have elsewhere, which he says relate simple constituents to other simple constituents of nature. It doesn't seem like there's going to be a way of compactly stating these principles. They're not going to be mathematically elegant in the way that candidate laws of physics are, and so forth. So here's the kind of schematic form of the nomological argument. A little bit more carefully. So premise one, the basic laws of nature have, either individually or as a system, so-and-so features, maybe simplicity, maybe they relate simple constituents, maybe they have a certain kind of mathematical form, maybe they have ubiquitous application. I'll say more about those in a second. Second, if dualism is true, the basic laws, either some of them individually or the system of laws, would not have these features, therefore dualism is false. So, the features in question, as I said. So, maybe you want a set of laws that are individually and collectively simple. They fit on the t-shirt. Maybe you want laws that instead of relating complex assemblages of billions of neurons to simple sensations, just relate simple constituents of nature. Maybe we have reason to think that other basic laws of nature have ubiquitous application in the sense that they apply kind of ubiquitously throughout nature, whereas the dualist laws are kind of weird in that they seem to apply to special rare configurations of matter. So they only kick in cosmically very rare and special circumstances where you get complex nervous systems arranged in certain ways. That seems to be very different from basic laws of gravitation or electromagnetism, which basically apply kind of throughout all space and time. You might think from physics that we have reason to think that the fundamental laws will have a certain kind of mathematical form, whereas there are arguments that you're not going to be able to mathematize the psychophysical laws. I think these are kind of complicated, but one reason is it's hard to impose a clean mathematical structure onto the space of possible experiences. Some experiences like color experience fall into kind of a neat three-dimensional space of phenomenal qualities, but other kinds of experiences like smell experience kind of resist any kind of mathematical formalization, or at least it's not clear how to describe them mathematically. And so having mathematical laws, you need to have some kind of mathematical description of the space of possible experiences. You'd need to have some kind of mathematically describable state space for the brain, and then you would need some kind of clean mapping. It's very unclear how you're going to achieve that. Okay. So the thought, the way Pouts puts this is it ruins the dream. So if the physicalism gives you this dream scenario of this nature all governed by a small set of simple comprehensive laws. Maybe they are simple enough to fit on a t-shirt. They're unified amongst themselves. They're simple and elegant and that's the whole show. It's a beautiful vision of nature. Whereas dualism, it looks like it gives you, well, on the one hand, the non-mental aspects of nature are this tidy system following a small set of simple principles. But then, in addition to that, kind of dangling off of it like a rotting albatross, we have this complex laundry list of extra psychophysical laws that link complex physical states to states of consciousness. They don't have the same simple, elegant mathematical form as the other laws. It kind of ruins the unity and the simplicity of the system of natural laws. So that's the basic worry. So what can be said in response? There's a flat-footed response that I'll note, but I don't really endorse. The flat-footed response says, like, yeah, sure. I mean, basically, you're pointing to the fact that physicalism is a simpler theory than dualism in a certain respect. I mean, it's simpler, obviously, in that it has fewer kinds of basic properties, fewer kinds of basic things, maybe. But also, more importantly, it's simpler in its set of basic laws of nature. So, and, you know, we normally think that all else equal, you should prefer similar theories. So there's a kind of theoretical advantage to simpler theories. But the flat-footed response says, you know, whatever a priori advantages physicalism has over dualism in virtue of its simplicity, it's ruled out a posteriori because it's just part of our evidence that consciousness exists as an irreducible feature of reality. So to unpack this a bit, I mean, the thought would be like, look, the plausible form of Occam's razor says that, you know, if you're comparing theories that equally fit the evidence or accommodate the known facts, then prefer the simpler of the two. It doesn't tell you to just prefer the simpler theory, period. If we wanted to do that, we could do a lot simpler than physicalism just by accepting like the ontological nihilist view that like there's nothing at all in reality. Reality is just a blank void. That's even simpler than physicalism. No one would accept that because it doesn't accommodate the data. Similarly, according to this flat-footed response, like the existence of consciousness as an irreducible feature of reality is just like a datum that any theory needs to accommodate, and physicalism might be like more plausible a priori in virtue of its simplicity, but it's ruled out a posteriori. The problem with this super flat-footed response, I think, is that it just ignores the fact that sometimes it's reasonable to, I mean, even though I kind of think it is a known fact, a plausible fact that consciousness exists and is irreducible, this flat-footed objection ignores that, you know, sometimes it's reasonable to reevaluate a claim's status as evidence and posit an illusion instead, if by doing so we can achieve a more plausible picture of reality. So, you know, suppose we've got like a really elegant, tidy theory of planetary motions, but we have like some single like one-off recording where like Mars is like temporarily does a little like swoop-de-doo or whatever. That just like doesn't fit any of our theories at all. In order to accommodate this alleged datum of the swoop-de-doo, you'd need like enormously complicated laws. It might make sense to say like maybe this was just like an error in the recording device or an illusion, or, you know, something went wrong. I don't know. What initially looked like part of our data, we're gonna like say maybe that was a false, a merely putative datum. Or, you know, simpler case, you know, maybe I notice that whenever my finger gets close to my nose, it like splits in two. And I like, but you know, only when both eyes are open. And so I go about trying to introduce some like unknown to physics, new physical laws that explains why my finger splits in two when it gets close to my nose, but only in the circumstances where both eyes are open. And it's this horribly gerrymandered law, but it fits the data because look, I can just see that it splits in two. I mean, here the right thing to do is like, okay, what you thought was like observed data that your finger splits in two, a more plausible thing to say here is, no, there's just an illusion. It seemed to split in two. You don't need a physical law to explain why it split in two because it didn't. Instead, you should explain why there's an illusion in these sorts of circumstances. And, you know, you can cook up a theory there. So maybe similarly, once you see that the kind of picture of reality you'd need in order to take at face value the alleged datum that consciousness exists and is irreducible, once you see how hideous that vision of reality is in terms of its nomological complexity and non-uniformity, you should reassess the status of that claim as evidence, posit some kind of illusion instead, and try to explain the illusion. You can explain why it seems to us as though consciousness exists, or it seems to us as though consciousness is irreducible, and achieve a more plausible vision of reality. There's another response. This is basically the David Chalmers response pursued in his book, The Conscious Mind, which I'll call the hopeful response, which is, he does like this t-shirt vision. He thinks like we should expect that the basic laws of nature are remarkably simple. They can fit on a t-shirt. So we should quest for basic psychophysical laws that are simple and elegant and t-shirt eligible. And he makes some gestures in this direction. He makes some very sketchy programmatic proposals about linking consciousness to kind of information states of physical systems. He doesn't, work it out in any detail. He mentions some choice points and kind of vaguely gestures in the right direction. But so this is kind of the hopeful response. And, we could say it's at least an open possibility, according to this view, that there is some simple, elegant, t-shirt worthy mapping from physical states onto experiences that we just haven't thought of yet. I am a little bit less hopeful, but I also don't think it's easy to rule this out. Yeah, I think it's just a hard question to evaluate. Like maybe there is some simple mapping between kind of abstract structural features of brains onto some space of experiences that really does kind of fit the mold of what we expect from physics, of like simple and elegant and mathematically clean. We haven't thought of it. Maybe that's because our data is so impoverished. I mean, in the case of consciousness, our data is basically limited to what we know from the first person case and what we can kind of reasonably extrapolate from there about other humans. And even when it gets to other animals or simpler creatures, we're pretty in the dark. And so maybe it's not surprising that we haven't come up with a good theory in this domain, just because kind of in principle, our data is going to be very impoverished when it comes to consciousness, much more impoverished than our data about like planetary movements or the movements of physical bodies. So maybe no surprise that we've been more successful in coming up with elegant mathematical theories of the physical domain, where we've got like a richer, less impoverished set of data than when it comes to consciousness. This is a response on the table. I don't have any big objections to it. It should be noted, it's not really the direction I'm most inclined to go in, but it's certainly a respectable response on the table. A third response, and this is part of my package of preferred responses, is to argue that while physicalism is going to have a simpler set of natural laws, this gain in simplicity is going to come at the cost of an increased complexity in the normative laws, and in such a way as to make it not clear at the end of the day whether physicalism has an advantage in simplicity with respect to the overall set of laws. So just to illustrate this point, suppose you're a dualist and you accept some hideously complex law for the experience of pain. So you've got a law of nature that says for all x, if phi x, then x is in pain, where phi is some like enormously complex physical property that, like, if you try to state it in reasonably fundamental terms, it's just hideously complex. This is kind of like, let's say, our best stab at the physical correlate of pain. Okay, so you've got this really complex law of nature. But my claim is that the dualist is going to have a much simpler set of basic normative laws, and the complexity that the dualist has in the natural laws is just going to kind of import over to complexity for the physicalist in his normative laws. So, like, let's just suppose that there's like a basic law of axiology of goodness and badness that says something like pain is bad, or for all x, it's bad for x to be in pain, something along these lines. This looks like an attractively simple law, as stated, but plausibly, what matters for the simplicity of a law is how simple or complex it is when stated in fundamental terms, or reasonably fundamental terms. Now, if dualism is true, this law that says for all x, it's bad for x to be in pain, that's already stated in fundamental terms, because pain is like a fundamental concept. It's a fundamental property. But if physicalism is true, then that is not stated in fundamental terms, because pain is absolutely not a fundamental property for physicalism. Given physicalism, in order to formulate this law in fundamental terms, you're going to have to cash out this mental term in more basic physical terms. So basically, you're going to have to replace the term pain with something like our term phi earlier, which is this enormously complex physical description of the known physical correlate of pain. So your normative pain law, when fundamentally expressed, is going to say something like, for all x, it's bad for x to be phi, where that's this hideously complex thing. So basically, it looks to me that, like, if you've got normative laws in your picture of reality, like you accept normativity as like a real thing and that there are principles or laws governing it, then you should want normative law. I mean, there's just as much theoretical pressure to have your normative laws be simple as to have your natural laws be simple. And it looks to me as though physicalism is just going to move the bump in the rug. So it decreases the complexity of the natural laws, but at the cost of a corresponding increase in the complexity of the normative laws. It's reversed for the dualist. The dualist is going to have a simpler set of normative laws, but a correspondingly more complex set of natural laws. Now, I'm not saying it's going to like balance out necessarily to perfectly even Steven. You'd need to look at detailed proposals about what the normative and the natural laws look like to make that assessment. But there's at least a large element of moving the bump in the rug here.
So at the Pacific APA, I was talking with Alex Proust, and he was asking me about my views about consciousness, and I was raising this nomological argument as one of my biggest worries for dualism, just to see what he thought about it. Actually, let me take a step back. If you recall, when I did my in-person interview with you at Princeton, which for the audience is linked in the description, one of my kind of raw thoughts in that discussion was that, and you had a response to this, my thought was like, it seems like the physicalist isn't in much better of a position than the dualist because they still have psychophysical mappings. Okay, fine, they don't take them to be laws, but they still have psychophysical mappings in the sense that there's at least some function which says which physical states are associated with or paired with, and you can metaphysically cash that out however you want. Maybe it's identity, maybe it's constitution, maybe it's grounding, whatever. There are certain physical states that are associated or paired with certain phenomenal states. The dualist takes those to be laws, but the physicalist still has these horrifically complex mappings or pairings or associations. Yeah. And I was wondering, well, then why isn't the physicalist in the same difficult boat? If I recall correctly, one of your responses to that, at least, was that at least in the case of the physicalist who has something like an identification between mental properties and physical properties, or mental states and physical states, arguably there's not much theoretical pressure to keep our identifications simple. I mean, after all, consider like a table, a particular table, like it's going to be identical to this horrifically complex properties or whatever, and particles arranged in a certain way. And so I guess there's not much theoretical pressure to make your identifications simple. By contrast, there arguably is pressure to make your fundamental laws pretty simple. Like it's a pretty good theoretical criterion where you just nomological parsimony. We should make our laws as simple as we can, other things being equal. Yeah. Now, I put this response to Alex Proust, and what he said was that, and I forget all the details. I wish I had recorded this, but it was just after a talk. He said something along the lines of, this will just then relocate the complexity into one's semantics. I forget all the details, but he said something like, we then just have an extremely complicated semantics of mental vocabulary, the physicalist, that is, where, pain somehow has to like single out this massively complex, massively arbitrary, massively vague mid-level subsystem or sub-process of, nervous systems. And basically just their semantic account of mental vocabulary is going to be horrifically complicated in comparison to the dualist. So he also has a very similar response. It's not so much where they shift the bump under the rug with respect to normative laws, but rather, I don't know if they're semantic laws, but just they'd have a much more complicated semantic account. Now, one way that you could try to get around that is to posit some kind of semantic pluralism that Dorr, Hawthorne, Yulee Vacquerie, and several others have posited, where, somehow mental vocabulary like pain and even things like person and agent, they actually pick out like just a huge collection of properties. And maybe that kind of, there's maybe a more plenitudinous picture to take this, where it's actually much simpler So it's not, you don't have this singularly selective semantic device, as it were. But then you get into like many subjects worries for those plenitudinous views, which we talked about in our previous discussion. So anyway, I just traced out a very complicated dialectic, and I apologize for the audience. This is a very kind of inside baseball game between people who know a lot about the philosophical literature. But I'm curious what you, Brian, think about just that dialectic that I traced out. I apologize to Alexander Proust because I kind of forget exactly what he said. But he basically said it's a similar maneuver where the complexity for the physicalists is just relocated to their semantics.
That's really interesting. I guess my initial thought is a physicalist. So I think it's correct that the semantic theory, or the, I guess, metasemantic theory, the theory of how reference or meaning works for the physicalist is going to be much more complicated than for the dualist. But my initial thought is, well, maybe the physicalist can say that's because semantics is itself a high-level, non-fundamental aspect of reality. Like, reference is not going to be in the list of fundamental properties or relations. And it's to be expected that high-level special sciences like semantics or geology or economics or whatever will not have simple laws when stated in fundamental terms. The thing that we want to keep simple is the fundamental laws of reality, and whatever the most basic principles of semantics aren't going to be fundamental laws of reality. They're going to be like high level principles, and there isn't the same kind of pressure to keep those high level principles simple when stated in fundamental terms. I guess my thought with the normativity challenge is, it seems to me more plausible that basic normative principles are fundamental simplicator. Like, why is pain bad? Why does having a seeming that P justify the belief that P? This feels to me like a rock bottom fact. Like, like when I say, like, why is it wrong for me to press this button? Well, because it would cause Joe an electric shock. Why is it wrong to cause Joe an electric shock? Well, because it would cause him lots of pain. Why is it wrong to cause lots of pain? Well, because pain is bad. Why is pain bad? I feel like this is a plausible stopping point. We've hit bedrock. I mean, we know explanation needs to end somewhere. This seems like roughly the place it's going to end. Or at least, maybe you could go like one or two layers deeper, but something normative seems to be like these basic bedrock principles, like the badness of pain or the justificatory power of experiences and so on. These seem to be bedrock principles that when you ask why they hold, the only thing to say is that's just how it is. We've hit bedrock. Explanation ends somewhere and it ends here. I actually think that's probably true with principles of metasemantics too, but I think that the intuitions there are a little less clear cut. So, but yeah, I think Proust's point is interesting. There's a related point that Adam Pouts makes in a few places, which is, suppose you think that with David Lewis, that one of the things that, like basically it's easier to refer to highly natural properties, highly joint carving properties, than to refer to like more gerrymandered, non-natural properties that fit our use. There's a worry with physicalism about whether it can explain kind of how easy it is to refer to consciousness. If the only reductions of consciousness available make it identical with some like really unnatural, gerrymandered, disjunctive physical property, then there's a worry about whether it can account for how easy it is to refer to it. That's related to, but I think distinct from the Proust point.
Yeah, and then one very final thing. Something that I think we mentioned in our previous discussion, which again for the audience I've linked to the description, is that arguably this point about not much pressure to keep our identification simple, well, I mean, it just doesn't apply to all physicalists. So some physicalists arguably will be facing that original objection that there are still these complicated mappings, like the grounding physicalists. Like arguably they're still going to be, and that's a very popular form of physicalism these days. So like they at least are going to seemingly have pretty similar problems with respect to their grounding laws.
Yeah,
or
and
if you don't like
Jonathan Schaffer concedes that point,
Yeah.
basically. So he's like the main pioneer of this grounding physicalism. He says, yes, we face a t-shirt problem. It's not clearly less serious than the t-shirt problem for dualism.
Right. Yeah, I just wanted to highlight that for the audience. Like, the physicalist isn't automatically out of the weeds here, and some very popular forms of physicalism still face the exact same objection here. I just wanted to mention that. But anyway.
Yeah. So let me go on to the thrust of this nomological objection. It relies on this claim that like we have reason to think that the fundamental laws are simple, or maybe have certain other properties. But let's focus on simplicity. I think it's an interesting and subtle and deep question. Like, why should we think the fundamental laws are simple, and to what extent are we justified in thinking so? So I think this could either be justified in a purely a priori way, or it could be justified a posteriori. So let's see if either of those routes are plausible. So a priori, I used to think that there was a good a priori reason for thinking that the laws are simple, but I now think that I was a little bit confused in that. So here's what I think now. I think there are good reasons to hold that the priors, like the ultimate prior probabilities that kind of roughly encode how likely various hypotheses are a priori, that the priors just must encode a pretty strong bias in favor of worlds that follow simple uniform patterns or simple uniform laws. Otherwise, we get inductive skepticism. And the argument for that is basically you can come up with all sorts of skeptical scenarios where observed regularities hold within our patch of reality, but fail in random unobserved parts. And those skeptical scenarios will predict our total evidence just as well as the ordinary non-skeptical hypothesis. So if you want to say that a posteriori, we're justified in believing that like the sun will rise tomorrow, or massive objects will still attract even in some unobserved corner of the galaxy, you basically have to say that a priori, there's a bias towards scenarios that follow simple uniform patterns. Otherwise, inductive skepticism, end of the world, horrible. So I think that argument is right. There is an a priori bias towards scenarios that follow simple uniform laws. However, all that means is that simply pattern mosaics. So think of like a mosaic as like a hypothesis about the way events or qualities are distributed across space and time. It means that simply patterned mosaics that follow simple regular patterns throughout, are more likely a priori than comparably specific unpatterned mosaics. I accept that. But that does not entail that it was likely a priori that the mosaic would follow simple patterns. So here's a really simple illustration to bring out that difference. Suppose I'm about to flip a coin 1,000 times, and you think there's a 99% chance that it's a fair coin. So almost certainly it's not going to be like a messy, it's not going to be a simple pattern. It's going to be like a messy random pattern sequence. But you think there's a 1% chance that I'm a trickster and I'm using like a trick coin with heads on both sides. Okay, so that means you think that there's slightly above 1% chance that the sequence will be all heads. Okay, so here your priors are in one sense massively biased towards the uniform scenario where it's all heads, because your credence is about 1% that it'll be all heads. That's a huge bias if we compare it with other comparably specific random looking sequences, because your prior in any random looking sequence is going to be about 1/2 to the 1,000, which is like a very, very small number. So basically the uniform sequence gets an a priori advantage here by a factor of something like over a Google, like just truly massive. But at the same time, it's unlikely that the sequence will be patterned. It's overwhelmingly more likely that the sequence will be unpatterned, despite the fact that there's a massive bias towards the simple sequence. Okay, so there's other more complex examples that can illustrate the same point, but that I think conveys the basic idea. So in order to avoid inductive skepticism, we need that pattern mosaics are more likely than comparably specific unpatterned mosaics. We do not need that it's likely a priori that the basic laws are simple. So I don't think there's a good argument from like avoiding inductive skepticism or vindicating ordinary or scientific inductive reasoning for thinking that a priori it was like more likely than not that the basic laws would be simple. There's some other Bayesian complexities here that I think in the interest of time I won't go into. I'll just make one point. Another reason to think like it's not a priori that the basic set of laws would be enormously simple is, scientists and philosophers often express surprise at the extent to which nature seems to be describable in terms of simple, mathematically elegant laws. So, Einstein has the famous remark about how the most incomprehensible thing about the universe is that it's comprehensible. And you get a bunch of famous scientists have said similar things, just like expressing their astonishment that like, wow, like nature follows these like simple, intelligible, mathematically elegant patterns. That's like so cool and not at all what we had any right to expect going in. What a wonderful world. And it is a wonderful world. But the fact that that's like surprising suggests that like maybe it wasn't a priori really likely that things would be like that. Maybe that, there's some kind of bias towards that puts it on the table a priori. It's like a respectable conjecture a priori, but it wasn't like likely a priori that things would turn out that way. Okay, so let's turn to the a posteriori justification. You might think, okay, sure, it wasn't a priori very likely that the total set of laws would be simple and elegant and lovely, but now we're in the 21st century now. We've done some science. We've got a posteriori reason to think that that's how the fundamental laws are, that they're remarkably simple. So I think on reflection, I don't know if this thought holds up. So first of all, I think it's plausible that we don't have a single example of we don't know even a single example of a fundamental law of nature. So like, to say that we have inductive grounds for thinking that the fundamental laws of nature will be simple from physics looks like an induction from zero cases, because I think we don't have any examples. What we have are theories where the basic laws of those theories are simple and elegant and mathematically precise, and where those theories are true or approximately true within certain domains or within certain scales. So you might think like, oh, the fact that we have theories that are true or approximately true within certain domains, and where the basic laws of the theory are simple, that suggests that the basic laws of reality, even though those aren't the basic laws of the theory, are themselves going to be simple. But I think I don't think there's good reason to think that. I mean, we know that simple, mathematically elegant patterns can arise at a high level, even though you have a much, much messier situation at a low level. So, this kind of thing happens, I don't know, like in economics, where like simple like demand and supply curves arise from like the aggregate behavior of individual consumers. Individual consumer psychology is a god-awful mess. Like everyone's a little bit different. There's all these irrationalities and eccentricities, but like it all kind of washes out to these like smooth mathematical patterns. Or, you flip a coin a bunch of times and each individual flip is a kind of unruly, anarchic thing, but certain stable patterns predictably arise in the aggregate. And so I think like even if like the base level of reality is pretty messy and not describable in terms of simple, elegant laws of the sort we have in physics, that's still compatible with, there being domains where these simple, elegant patterns emerge, like in general relativity or in quantum mechanics or whatever. So I think the fact that we have theories whose basic laws are simple and elegant, that are true and approximately true within certain domains and certain scales, is not good empirical evidence that the base level of reality is really tidy. It could be very messy. There's also like an observation selection effect here. Like the search space for complex laws is just much, much bigger than the search space for simple laws. So the laws we have discovered, you would just expect them to be simple, but in a way that doesn't allow for like inductive projection. So like, if all the missing coins that I found are in the under the lamplight, that doesn't inductively support the conclusion that all the missing coins are under the lamplight, because you wouldn't expect to see the ones that are not under the lamplight. And so like, if if there were, I don't know, so, I mean, this is true even for non-fundamental laws. So like, so suppose there's like some lawful relationship between the mass of a planet and the amount of like carbon in its atmosphere, or the amount of helium in its atmosphere. If that relationship is like a simple linear relationship, we'll likely discover it once we get enough data. If the relationship is like a complex polynomial of degree 74, we almost certainly won't discover it, just because the search space for equations with that many adjustable parameters is just much larger, and we're just like not going to explore it. So I think even if we did find some candidate fundamental laws that were pretty simple, there would be something a little bit dicey about like inductively generalizing from there, that the total set of fundamental laws, or all fundamental laws, are remarkably simple because of the kind of like lamplight observation selection worries. So I guess, I mean, there's a lot more to say about this, but I don't think that we have strong reason a posteriori to think that even the non-mental portions of reality comprise this like nice tidy system governed by a small set of simple laws. Like, so call this the tidy system hypothesis, that at least non-mental reality is governed by this small, comprehensive, simple set of laws. I think this has the status of a respectable conjecture. Like, people like Steven Weinberg talk about like dreams of a final theory. I think it's like a good and noble pursuit to like try to find the final theory of physics and hope that it has this tidy structure. And I think it's a respectable conjecture that the physical world is like this, but it's merely a respectable conjecture. It's not something that we have strong reason to believe, either a priori or a posteriori. So I think once we kind of calibrate on like what the epistemic status is of this tidy system hypothesis, the cost for dualism is at worst that it conflicts with a respectable conjecture, not that it conflicts with something that we antecedently had strong reason to believe. So, it's like, I think it's on a par with other respectable conjectures like determinism, or the eternity of the past, or the discreteness of space-time. Like, these are all things that, like, these are legitimate research programs to try to investigate respectable conjectures, but nothing more than that. Yeah, I'll just try to say one more quick thing. So this is kind of my very tentatively preferred response to the nomological objection. So despite what I just said, I do have a soft spot for this tidy system hypothesis as regards non-mental reality. I mean, I think it's just like a lovely, beautiful kind of Leibnizian vision where like it all arises from this small set of simple, elegant principles. And at the same time, I'm not as hopeful as David Chalmers that we will find like a compact, tidy systematization of the psychophysical correlations. So I am kind of inclined at the end of the day to think that the vision of nature is just like tidy physical system plus a really messy set of psychophysical laws. And I'm sympathetic to the concern that if we compare these like two visions of nature as comprehensive accounts of reality, the physicalist view just looks much better. Like, on the one hand, we've got this tidy, clean, beautiful system. On the other hand, we have like that plus this rotting albatross of extra psychophysical laws dangling off of it that destroys the unity and simplicity of the system. Like, considered as total visions of reality, I'm sympathetic to the idea that the second one is just absurd. That's not a sensible way for reality to be. But I think the second vision gets less unattractive if the natural world, if we reject naturalism and kind of embed the natural world within a larger explanatory structure, and thereby achieve like a new kind of gestalt unity at the higher level. So the kind of explanatory structure, I would prefer would be like theistic or some kind of axiarchic view, but let's work with theism where, nature has its source in, a God who's good and acts for the sake of the good. On this view, like a large part of the purpose of nature, the large part of the reason why nature exists at all is for the sake of consciousness and other goods that essentially are linked to consciousness, like rational agency and knowledge and friendship and virtue and pleasure and so forth. And once you see nature within that kind of larger gestalt, the idea that like the laws for consciousness would be a bit different than the laws for physics, for physics and so forth, doesn't seem so crazy. I mean, consciousness is like the point, or a large part of the point of nature. Things are going to behave a little bit differently when it comes to consciousness. And when you take this vision, some other kind of striking aspects of the purely physical laws kind of snap into place within this new gestalt and take on like a new kind of like, oh, that makes sense. Well, take like the simplicity and the intelligibility and the beauty and elegance of these laws. Okay, like simplicity is needed for a degree of like knowledge and to expand the scope of our agency, to understand the regularities of nature. Intelligibility is kind of like, well, to achieve the goods of like deep comprehensive knowledge of reality, fine-tuningness for the sake. So like I think that even though just comparing like naturalistic visions, tidy physical system versus tidy physics plus messy psychophysics, the tidy physical system looks much better. I think things maybe look a bit different if we can think of hypotheses that embed the natural world within larger explanatory structures. Then the dualist view with its messy psychophysical laws doesn't look so bad. There's a kind of gestalt unity and intelligibility to it.
I certainly think that's something that we can agree about. I mean, I think naturalistic dualism, to me, seems very difficult to accept.
That I think is like one of my takeaways. And I think an important takeaway of like the post-Chalmers, because Chalmers defended what he called naturalistic dualism. And I think like, if you think hard about dualism and what it requires and what it entails, like the naturalist versions of it are just not going to be very tenable.
Yeah, and I think that, I mean, it's really interesting because at least in, the apologetics sphere and whatnot, some of the pop apologists are rightly lampooned for equating atheism with materialism and whatnot. But it's like a horseshoe effect. It's like you get the pop apologist level where, they almost like equate them, which, that's bad. But, and then you start going on to the other end of the horseshoe, you get to the middle where it's like, no, you can be an atheist and perfectly well accept that there are souls, and like, you can be an idealist and you can accept all that stuff. That's kind of the middle of the horseshoe. But then as you progress in philosophical understanding, you get to the other end of the horseshoe and it's like, okay, fine. They're not equated, but there are some pretty serious evidential connections between taking consciousness as a very robust kind of fundamental feature of reality, a kind of highly dualistic view or dualist adjacent view, and a more theistic or at least quasi-theistic or theistic adjacent view. Those kind of mesh very, very nicely together in such a way that we kind of have this horseshoe effect.
Right. I mean, I'm thinking of like the midwit meme where on the left you have like dualism goes with God, and then same on the right, but on the middle you have like David Chalmers, who's definitely not a midwit, but in this meme, he's there saying like, no, you don't have to accept God to accept an extra irreducible consciousness. David Chalmers is definitely not a midwit by any
Of course.
stretch.
I have been coming around to that view, which is very interesting. Again, the meme is supposed to be simplistic. Like, we're not saying that it like absolutely requires theism. There are lots of other options: aesthetic deism, axiarchism, various natural teleological views. But the point is just that some sort of either value selection hypothesis or something funny is going on if you go in for kind of robust dualist picture. I think that's maybe one of the broader takeaways of our discussion here. Well, do you have any kind of concluding final comments, either about objections to dualism or about anything else that we've talked about today before I do my little closing spiel?
One quick summary point. I think pretty much all the objections we've looked at fall under one of two headings and sometimes straddle both. One is like worries about causal interaction, and the other is worries about simplicity or Occam's razor kind of things, where most of the law stuff at the end is more of the simplicity Occam's razor. A lot of the stuff we talked about at the beginning is causal interaction. A lot of them, I think, straddle both. My leaning is that the simplicity Occam's razor worries are a bit more forceful than the pure causal interaction worries. But I'm pretty contented dualist, so none of them bothers me too much.
All right. Well, thank you, Brian, for coming on. This was a very edifying presentation and discussion. And audience as well, type down there if you enjoyed this. Thank you, Brian, because he put together this presentation. He did this for Majesty of Reason. This is just an amazing thing. He's dedicated to public philosophy and educating people. That's extremely valuable. So all my audience members should also be very thankful to Brian as well. Check out the links in the description, peeps, because I've put down there other videos that I've done with Brian. I've done at least 2 in-person interviews with Brian, and maybe I'll put some other stuff down there as well. I put links to his Phil Papers profile where you can see his various amazing papers. And of course, if you made it this far, then you probably see value in the work that I do. So firstly, smash that like button, turn on that little bell for notifications, consider supporting me on Patreon. Any amount helps and you get lots of cool and exclusive goodies. And of course, what better way to end is there than? I'm Joe Schmid. This is the Majesty of Reason, and peace